I used to think I had it all: a beautiful wife, a cozy home, and dreams of starting a family. We were that couple everyone admired, the kind that made others say, "You two are perfect together." But somewhere along the way, things started to fall apart, and now I'm left wondering how it all went so wrong. Susan and I decided to try for a baby about 5 years into our marriage. Life was good: stable jobs, a nice house, and more than enough love between us to bring a child into the world. At first, it was exciting. We were hopeful, sharing quiet smiles and whispered jokes about baby names late at night. But after a few months of trying with no results, the excitement faded. "It's normal," Susan reassured me. "These things take time." I wanted to believe her. We told ourselves it was no big deal, but every month that passed chipped away at that confidence. After the first year, we decided to see a doctor. The tests came back with no real answers, no obvious issues on either side. "It happens sometimes," the doctor said. "Keep trying, stay positive." We nodded, thanked him, and left the office holding hands. But walking out of there, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were stepping into something much bigger than we'd prepared for. The second year hit us harder. We tried everything: changing our diets, tracking ovulation, even fertility treatments. We poured money into specialists and clinics, hoping for a miracle. But month after month, we were met with the same disappointment. At first, we consoled each other. Susan would say, "We'll get there eventually," and I'd nod, pretending I believed it. But over time, those reassurances felt more like empty words. I started staying out later, grabbing drinks with coworkers, or losing myself in video games to avoid thinking about what wasn't happening at home. Susan, on the other hand, threw herself into work and spent hours researching new treatments. She was determined, even when it became clear that neither of us really knew what to do next. We didn't fight, but the silence between us grew heavier. I could feel her disappointment in me, though she never said it outright. I knew I was failing her, failing us, but I didn't know how to fix it. One night, I came home after a late night out with my best friend Mike. He's been my rock during all this, someone who always knew how to make me laugh when I needed it. When I walked in, Susan was sitting on the couch, staring at the TV. She didn't even look upset, just tired. She gave me this small, sad smile, and I hated myself for it. I wanted to apologize, to tell her I'd try harder, but the words stuck in my throat. By the third year, the routine was eating us alive. Doctors still said the same thing: "Keep trying." Susan kept her head up, at least on the surface, but I could see the cracks starting to form. We were two people going through the motions, each too afraid to say out loud what we were both thinking. What if it never happens? I still held onto a shred of hope. I told myself that maybe, someday, things would turn around. But deep down, I was starting to wonder if we'd already lost something we couldn't get back. After years of disappointment, Susan still hadn't given up. She was relentless in her search for answers, always reading articles, researching new clinics, and chasing the faintest sliver of hope. Me? I wasn't so sure anymore. I didn't have her strength. One evening, she told me she found a new clinic that offered some cutting-edge treatments. "It's a little far," she admitted, "but they've had great results. I really think this could work." Her eyes were filled with that same optimism I'd fallen in love with years ago, but now it only made me feel guilty. How could I tell her I didn't think any of this would change anything? "Let's do it," I said instead, forcing a smile. I wanted to believe it was possible, for her sake, if not for mine. The process was grueling, physically and emotionally. The treatments were expensive, the schedules rigid, and the waiting unbearable. Susan handled it better than I did. She always did. I went through the motions, trying to be supportive, but deep down, I felt like a fraud. Every time I saw her disappointed face when the tests came back negative, it chipped away at me a little more. That's when I started drinking more. It wasn't like I became a drunk overnight, but it started with a beer or two after work to unwind. Then it became a few beers, then whiskey on the weekends. It made it easier to numb the frustration, the anger at myself for feeling like I was failing her. I also leaned harder into video games. I'd sit for hours in front of the screen, losing myself in some fictional world where nothing was real and nothing mattered. It was easier than facing the reality of my life. Susan noticed, of course, but she didn't say much. Maybe she thought I needed my own way to cope. Or maybe she was just too exhausted to argue. During all this, Mike started coming around more often. He'd always been my closest friend, but now he was becoming something of a fixture in our lives. He'd swing by with a six-pack or offer to help Susan with errands if I was too busy. "You're lucky to have him," Susan said once after he'd left. And she was right. Mike was solid. He listened when I vented, he cracked jokes to lighten the mood, and he always seemed to know exactly what to say. The thing is, I started to rely on him too much. Instead of talking to Susan about how I felt, I talked to Mike. It was just easier that way. Then one evening, Susan came home looking pale and exhausted. She dropped her bag by the door and slumped onto the couch. "I'm not feeling great," she said, rubbing her temples. "I've been so tired lately, and I feel nauseous all the time. I'm going to call the clinic tomorrow." I frowned, more concerned than I wanted to let on. "It's probably stress," I said, sitting down next to her. "You've been running yourself into the ground with all this." "Maybe," she replied quietly. But the way she looked at me, there was something in her eyes. Hope. That fragile, persistent hope that I could never fully understand. The next morning, she went in for some tests. I stayed home, nursing a slight hangover from the whiskey I'd poured myself the night before. When she got back, she seemed calmer, like she was waiting for something, but didn't want to jinx it by talking about it. "Maybe this is it," she said later that night, as we were getting ready for bed. "Maybe this is our last chance." I didn't know what to say. All I could do was nod and hope I looked more confident than I felt. I'll never forget the moment Susan told me she was pregnant. It was a regular Tuesday evening. She came home from work, looking pale but with this light in her eyes I hadn't seen in years. I was on the couch, halfway through a game, and her tone made me pause mid-action. "I need to tell you something," she said, standing in the doorway. "What's wrong?" I asked, setting the controller down. She handed me a folded piece of paper. My hand shook slightly as I opened it. The word positive stared back at me, and for a moment, I couldn't believe it. "You're pregnant?" I said, barely above a whisper. She nodded, tears streaming down her cheeks. "I'm pregnant," she said softly. I pulled her into my arms, overwhelmed by the weight of those words. After everything we'd been through, after years of disappointment, here it was. Hope. From that moment, I turned my life around. I quit drinking and boxed up my gaming consoles. Even Mike noticed the change in me, joking, "Look at you, already acting like a responsible dad." Susan started glowing in every way. She laughed more, hummed while cooking, and spent hours on Pinterest, planning the perfect nursery. It was like the version of us we used to be had come back to life. Mike was thrilled when we told him the news. "Finally," he said, clapping me on the back. "I told you it would happen." He became even more involved after that, offering to drive Susan to appointments or run errands when I was working. At the time, I didn't think much of it. Mike had always been part of our lives, and having an extra set of hands during her pregnancy was a relief. One evening, as we were winding down, Susan brought up the idea of godparents. "What about Mike?" she asked. "For the godfather?" I said, a little surprised but not against it. "Yeah," she replied. "He's always been there for us. He cares about us, and I think he'd be perfect." I thought about it for a moment before nodding. "You're right. He'd be great." When we told Mike, he laughed. "You're making it official, huh? Uncle Mike has a nice ring to it." By the time Susan was in her second trimester, things felt good again, better than they had in years. I started to believe we'd finally made it through the worst of it. Looking back, there were little things I should have noticed. How Susan would sometimes trail off mid-conversation, as if she was holding something back. Or how Mike always seemed to show up exactly when she needed something. But at the time, I didn't question it. Why would I? Mike was my best friend, and Susan was my wife. If I couldn't trust them, who could I trust? So, when we chose Mike as the godfather, it felt like the perfect decision. Like everything was finally falling into place. I didn't realize it was all balancing on the edge of a knife. The day our baby was born was the happiest day of my life. I remember every detail. The fluorescent lights of the hospital room, the sound of Susan's steady breathing between contractions, and the moment I first held my son. He was so small, so perfect, with these tiny fingers that wrapped around mine, as if he already knew me. I looked at Susan, exhausted but glowing, and I felt this overwhelming rush of gratitude. For the first time in years, everything felt right. All the pain, the waiting, the failures, it all led to this moment, and it was worth every second. We named him Jacob. From the moment we brought him home, he became the center of our world. Our nights were sleepless, and the days blurred together in a haze of diapers, bottles, and lullabies, but I loved every second of it. Susan was amazing, patient, and attentive, even when she was running on just a couple hours of sleep. Mike, as Jacob's godfather, was thrilled. He showed up at the hospital the day after the birth with flowers for Susan and a giant teddy bear for Jacob. "Uncle Mike reporting for duty," he joked, and I couldn't help but laugh. At first, his help was invaluable. He'd bring over meals when Susan and I were too tired to cook, or watch Jacob for an hour so we could nap. I was grateful. After all, Mike had always been like family to us, and his excitement about Jacob only made me feel closer to him. But as the weeks turned into months, something started to feel off. Mike was around all the time. At first, I didn't think much of it. He was just being a supportive friend, right? But then there were little things that began to nag at me. Like how Jacob seemed to calm down faster when Mike held him, or how Mike always seemed to know exactly what Susan or Jacob needed, sometimes before I did. I told myself I was being ridiculous. Mike had always been attentive. That was just who he was. But there was this one moment I couldn't shake. It was a quiet Sunday afternoon. Susan and I were sitting on the couch while Mike was playing with Jacob on the floor. Jacob was giggling, his tiny hands reaching for the toy Mike was holding. I watched him for a moment, smiling, but then Susan leaned forward slightly and caught Mike's eye. The look they shared was so brief I almost missed it, but it made my stomach twist. It wasn't anything obvious, nothing someone else might notice, but it felt intimate, like they were sharing a thought they didn't want me to know about. I told myself I was imagining it, that I was just tired or overthinking things. Susan and I had been through so much together. There was no way she would betray me like that. And Mike? He was my best friend. The idea that anything could be going on between them felt impossible. Still, that moment stuck with me. Over the next few weeks, I started paying closer attention. I noticed how Susan would sometimes light up when Mike walked into the room, or how he'd offer to stay late and help with Jacob even when I told him it wasn't necessary. I didn't want to believe there was anything to worry about, but a small part of me couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The feeling that something was off between Susan and Mike wouldn't leave me alone. I told myself I was being paranoid, that I was reading too much into small things, but the doubt lingered. Every now and then, I'd catch myself replaying moments in my head, like that quick look they shared on the couch, or the way Susan seemed happier when Mike was around. I decided to push the thoughts aside and focus on my family. Maybe I'd been distant for too long, and this was just my way of projecting my guilt onto Susan and Mike. So, I made a conscious effort to be more present. I started coming home earlier from work, taking overnight shifts with Jacob, and planning little surprises for Susan, like her favorite takeout or a quick coffee run before she started her day. But something about her felt closed off. She didn't pull away entirely, but she wasn't as engaged as I'd hoped. When I asked her how she was feeling, or if there was anything she needed, she'd just smile faintly and say, "I'm fine." I wanted to believe her, but it felt like she was keeping me at arm's length. Then there was Mike. I started limiting how often he came over, suggesting that Susan and I could handle things ourselves. "You don't have to keep running over here, man," I told him once, trying to keep my tone light. "You've done enough." "Are you kidding? I love spending time with you guys," he said, grinning as he gave Jacob a little fist bump. "Besides, I know how exhausting this phase can be." I forced a smile, but inside, I hated how natural he made it all seem. It was like he belonged here, like he was part of our family. Things came to a head during a family gathering at my cousin's house. It was supposed to be a fun afternoon, a barbecue, kids running around, everyone catching up. Susan was holding Jacob, chatting with my aunt, while Mike hovered nearby, laughing and joking like he always did. At one point, my cousin leaned in and said, "Man, Mike really likes to help out, huh? He's here more than you are sometimes." He chuckled, but there was something in his tone that made my stomach twist. I laughed it off, but for the rest of the day, I couldn't stop thinking about it. Later that week, I came home early from work, hoping to surprise Susan. The house was quiet except for her voice, muffled through the closed bedroom door. She was on the phone. I couldn't help but stop and listen when I heard her tone. It was low, almost anxious. "I just don't want him to find out. she said. My heart stopped. She was quiet for a moment, then let out a nervous laugh. No, no one's going to say anything. He'd never suspect it. I backed away from the door, my mind racing. What was she talking about? What didn't she want me to find out? When she came out of the room a few minutes later, I pretended nothing was wrong. She smiled at me like everything was fine, and I forced myself to smile back, but inside, I was falling apart. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every worst-case scenario played out in my head. Was she hiding something about Jacob? About us? About Mike? I wanted to confront her right then and there, but I was terrified of what she might say. Instead, I decided to wait. I needed proof, something solid before I brought it up. But deep down, I knew my life was about to change in ways I wasn't ready for. After hearing Susan's phone conversation, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was horribly wrong. The words replayed in my mind over and over. He'd never suspect it. What didn't she want me to know? I told myself to stay calm, to watch and wait. If I overreacted without proof, I could destroy everything for nothing. But as the days went on, it became harder to ignore the little things. Susan had always been confident, but now she seemed jittery, especially when Mike's name came up. If I mentioned him casually, something like, Mike said he might swing by this weekend, she'd freeze for just a second before quickly responding. It was subtle, but it was there. Then there were the people around us. At work, a coworker made a passing comment when I mentioned Mike helping out with Jacob. Man, he's there for you a lot. Huh, he said, raising an eyebrow. It was just a joke, but it landed wrong. I brushed it off with a laugh, but inside, it felt like everyone knew something I didn't. The worst moment came at a neighborhood barbecue. One of the guys in our group, a friend of Mike's, casually said, "You know, Mike's been playing house with you guys, huh? He's probably going to start paying rent soon." Everyone laughed, but I felt like the ground had been pulled out from under me. I started watching them more closely, how they acted when they thought I wasn't looking. I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something between them, something unspoken but undeniable. One evening, while Susan was out running errands, I found myself pacing the living room, consumed by the nagging doubt in my mind. I couldn't take it anymore. I had to know. I went to our bedroom, my heart pounding as I opened her closet. I wasn't sure what I was even looking for, something, anything, that would prove my fears wrong or right. At first, it was just clothes, shoes, the usual. But then I saw a small, decorative box on the top shelf, tucked away behind a stack of old scarves. I reached for it, feeling like my hands weren't even my own. Inside the box was a collection of little mementos, photos, postcards, things from before we were married. But one item stood out, a small, elegant bracelet with a tag attached. The tag read, "To Susan, with all my love, Mike." My heart dropped. I stared at it, my mind racing. Why was this here? Why had she kept it? It wasn't just the bracelet, it was the context. I didn't remember her ever mentioning it, and certainly not showing it to me. If it had been a simple, harmless gift, why hide it? When Susan came home that night, I tried to act normal, but I couldn't look at her the same way. The bracelet was like a weight in my mind, pulling me deeper into suspicion. That night, as she slept peacefully beside me, I stared at the ceiling, my thoughts spiraling. I couldn't keep this to myself any longer. I needed answers. I couldn't hold it in anymore. That bracelet, the way Susan and Mike acted, the comments from people, it was all piling up, and I needed answers. The next morning, I walked into the kitchen where Susan was making coffee. My heart was racing, but I forced myself to speak. "Hey," I said, trying to sound calm. She glanced up, sensing something was off. "Morning. Everything okay?" I sat down at the table and pulled the bracelet from my pocket, placing it in front of me. "We need to talk." Her eyes locked on the bracelet, and I saw her expression shift from surprise to unease. "Where did you find that?" "In your closet," I replied. "Why do you still have it?" She hesitated, fidgeting with the handle of her mug. "It's just an old gift. It doesn't mean anything. With all my love, doesn't sound like nothing, Susan," I said, my voice firmer than I intended. "Why didn't you ever tell me about this?" She looked away, her voice quieter now. "I didn't think it mattered. It's from a long time ago, before we were married. I forgot it was even there." I leaned forward, my frustration boiling over. "Be honest. Did something happen between you And Mike. What? No, she shot back, her voice sharp. How could you even think that? Because it feels like you're hiding something, I said. The way you act when he's around. How he's always here. It doesn't add up. Her face fell, and for a moment, she just stared at me. Then she sighed and said, fine. Mike had feelings for me a long time ago. He told me once, but I shut it down. That's it. Nothing happened. I stared at her, my mind racing. Why didn't you tell me this before? Because I didn't want to make things weird, she said, her voice trembling. I thought it was over. I didn't think it mattered. I wanted to believe her, but her words felt too neat, too rehearsed. I pressed on. Do you swear nothing happened? I swear, she said, meeting my eyes, but only for a second. I leaned back, my stomach in knots. Her answers didn't feel like the whole truth, and I couldn't shake the doubt in my chest. Finally, I said, I want to do a paternity test. Susan's face froze. What? I need to know, I said. After everything, I need to be sure. That's ridiculous, she said, standing up. How can you even think Jacob isn't yours? Then prove it, I said quietly. If there's nothing to hide, prove it. She stared at me, her hands trembling. After a long pause, she let out a shaky breath. Fine. If that's what it takes, fine. Her words were sharp, but her tone was all I needed to confirm what I already feared. The drive to the lab was silent. Neither of us said a word, and the air in the car felt heavy, like the weight of what we were about to do was pressing down on both of us. Susan stared out the window, her hands folded tightly in her lap, while I gripped the steering wheel so hard my knuckles turned white. The test itself was straightforward. A lab technician greeted us, handed us a clipboard with consent forms, and led us into a small room. She explained the process. Simple cheek swabs from me, Susan, and Jacob. It took less than 10 minutes, but those 10 minutes felt like hours. As I held Jacob in my lap, I couldn't help but stare at his tiny face. He smiled up at me, blissfully unaware of the turmoil surrounding him. I wanted to believe he was mine. I needed to believe it. Susan stayed quiet the entire time, only speaking when the technician asked her to confirm her name or sign a form. Her usual confidence was gone, replaced by a nervous energy she couldn't quite hide. When it was done, the technician smiled politely and said, "We'll notify you as soon as the results are ready. Usually, it takes about 48 hours. I nodded, thanked her, and walked out of the lab with Susan trailing behind me. The next 2 days were some of the longest of my life. I threw myself into work, but my mind kept drifting back to the test. At home, things were worse. Susan and I barely spoke. She spent most of her time with Jacob, avoiding me unless it was absolutely necessary. I couldn't stop replaying everything in my head. The moments I might have missed, the signs I ignored. Was there a time when she and Mike were too close, and I just didn't see it? My mind was a whirlwind of doubt and anger. I tried to keep myself busy. I mowed the lawn, cleaned out the garage, even rearranged the furniture in the living room. Anything to avoid sitting still and letting my thoughts consume me. But no matter what I did, the same question echoed in my head. What if he's not mine? Susan wasn't much better. She avoided eye contact, stayed in Jacob's room longer than usual, and seemed lost in her own thoughts. Once, I caught her standing in the kitchen, staring blankly at the wall with her hands trembling. When she noticed me watching, she quickly busied herself, pretending everything was fine. On the second evening, I sat on the couch, staring at my phone, waiting for the notification. Every time it buzzed, my heart jumped, only to sink when it wasn't the lab. Finally, the notification came through. The results were ready. "Susan," I called out, my voice strained. She walked into the living room, holding Jacob. "Is it time?" I nodded. "We need to go to the lab." The car ride there was even quieter than the first. Neither of us spoke, and the tension in the air was almost suffocating. I glanced at Susan a few times, but her expression was unreadable. When we arrived, the receptionist led us to a small office where the technician was waiting with a sealed envelope. My palms were sweating as she handed it to me. "This will have all the information you need," she said with a polite smile. "Let me know if you have any questions." I held the envelope in my hands, my heart pounding. This was it. The truth was in my hands, and whatever it said would change everything. I looked at Susan. She was pale, her lips pressed tightly together. She nodded slightly, as if giving me permission to open it. I took a deep breath, my fingers trembling as I slid the envelope open. The room felt suffocating as I unfolded the paper. My eyes scanned the text until I found the words that shattered everything. Probability of paternity, 0%. I froze, rereading it over and over, hoping it would somehow change. It didn't. Jacob wasn't mine. My chest tightened, and the room seemed to spin. I looked up at Susan. Her face was pale, and her eyes filled with tears. "It's not what you think," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Not what I think?" I snapped, throwing the paper onto the table. "It says he's not my son. What else am I supposed to think?" She broke down, tears streaming down her cheeks. "It happened once," she said, "with Mike. It was a mistake, and I didn't know how to tell you." I thought, "A mistake?" I interrupted, my voice rising. "You slept with my best friend, and you didn't think I deserved to know? You've been lying to me for years, Susan." She tried to reach for me, but I pulled away. "I thought it was over," she pleaded. "I didn't know Jacob wasn't yours until now. I swear." Her words cut deep, but I couldn't listen anymore. "I can't do this," I muttered, standing up abruptly. "Wait," she cried, following me. "Where are you going?" "I need time to think," I said coldly before walking out the door. I drove aimlessly, my mind racing. The betrayal burned in my chest. But every time I thought about Jacob, I felt something else, a desperate need to protect him. He wasn't just her child, or Mike's child. He was mine in every way that mattered. I made my decision. I drove back home late that night, my jaw clenched as I walked through the door. Susan sat on the couch, her face swollen from crying. She stood when she saw me. "You came back," she said softly, but I didn't answer. I went straight to Jacob's room, packed a bag with his things, and gently picked him up from his crib. He stirred but stayed asleep as I carried him toward the door. "What are you doing?" Susan's voice cracked with panic. "I'm taking him," I said, my voice flat. "You can't do this," she cried, following me. "Please, let's talk." I turned to her, my anger boiling over. "You lied to me, Susan. You don't get to decide anymore." She reached for me, but I walked out, strapping Jacob into his car seat before driving off into the night. I ended up in a small motel a few towns over, laying Jacob down in the portable crib I'd grabbed from home. My phone buzzed nonstop, calls from Susan and even Mike, but I ignored them all. By morning, the weight of what I'd done started to settle in. I turned on my phone and froze when I saw the news headline: "Local authorities searching for missing child." They'd reported me to the police. But as I looked at Jacob sleeping peacefully, I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't ready to let him go. Not yet. I could hear them outside, the crunch of boots on gravel, the hum of radio static, and the low murmur of voices. They'd found me. Jacob was asleep in the crib, oblivious to the chaos brewing outside. I sat on the edge of the bed, my head in my hands, trying to figure out what to do. My phone had been buzzing for hours, but I couldn't bring myself to answer. I couldn't face Susan, couldn't face Mike. A booming voice broke through the silence. "This is the police. We know you're inside. Please come out with your hands up. No one needs to get hurt." I didn't move. My mind raced, replaying every moment that had brought me here. The betrayal, the lies, the heartbreak. And yet, through it all, Jacob's face was the only thing I could think about. He didn't deserve this. The voice came again, calm but firm. "We just want to resolve this peacefully. Bring the child out, and we'll talk." Then I heard her, Susan's voice, trembling and desperate, through a loudspeaker. "Please, just come out. Let's figure this out together. Jacob needs you." Her words stung. "He needs me?" I thought bitterly. He needed honesty, a stable home, parents who didn't betray each other. Instead, he got this, a mess created by the two people who were supposed to love him the most. Tears welled up in my eyes as I looked at Jacob, still peacefully unaware. I picked him up gently, cradling him in my arms. He stirred and opened his eyes, looking up at me with a sleepy smile. For a moment, the weight of the situation lifted. "I love you, buddy," I whispered, my voice cracking. "I always will." But I knew what I had to do. As much as I wanted to hold on to him, to protect him from everything, I couldn't put him in danger. This wasn't just about me anymore. I stood, my legs shaky, and walked to the door. I could see the flashing lights outside, the officers standing in position. The voice on the loudspeaker came again. "Step outside slowly, with your hands visible." I opened the door, holding Jacob close to my chest. The cold air hit me as I stepped out, the bright lights blinding. "I'm coming out," I called, my voice hoarse. The officers moved incautiously. "Set the child down," one of them instructed. I looked at Jacob one last time, my heart breaking as I kissed his forehead. "Be good, okay?" I whispered. I set him down on the ground, and an officer immediately scooped him up, carrying him to safety. Susan's sobs echoed in the distance, but I didn't look. I couldn't. "On your knees, hands behind your head," another officer commanded. I did as they said, feeling the cold gravel bite into my knees. The handcuffs snapped onto my wrists, and for the first time in days, I felt the fight leave my body. It was over. They led me to a squad car, and as I sat in the back seat, I caught a glimpse of Susan holding Jacob tightly. Mike was there too, his arm around her shoulders. The sight made my stomach churn, but I forced myself to look away. Sitting in the cold, empty cell that night, I thought about Jacob. He wasn't mine by blood, but in my heart, he'd always be my son. I'd made mistakes, but everything I did was for him. And somehow, despite the pain, that thought brought me a small sense of peace.